It is that time of year again. All the new releases from all the brands are starting to trickle through, and the first one that we have is the Tag Heuer Aquaracer Professional 200 Date. There's been a couple of upgrades that look awesome. I hope you all like my new cushion. Basically, what's happened is I'm getting old and my back's sore. But today I will move through the back pain because these new Tag Heuer Aquaracer models were on my desk. The first thing that strikes you about these models has to be, firstly, the dial and then the bezel. So let's talk about it. We are going to do this review a little bit differently because of that dial and because of that bezel. So let's start with the dial, which is by far one of the most attractive things about this model in my humble opinion. It has a blue gradient starting at the center and then it runs out into the black, which is, to me, quite frankly, stunning. Then it has the hexagonal shapes through the dial, giving it that extra layer of depth. This dial is really, really clean, and I'm really glad that Tag have pushed the boundaries and used something a little bit different. Another highlight on the dial has to be the 6 o'clock date window. For those of you that know me, you'll know that I'm a big fan of 6 o'clock date windows. I think it adds symmetry to a watch, and being a photographer, I'm always looking in the lines and things. But another little detail that they've added or taken away is the Cyclops eye. This is a personal thing, but personally, I'm not that into the Cyclops eye, so I'm really into this. I think this is a huge design change and I really, really like it. It's funny, I'm looking at this Tag Heuer model now, and because it has that gradient on the dial with the date window being so symmetrical and the text above it being symmetrical and the Tag logo above it being symmetrical, everything draws you into the middle of this watch, including the hexagonal bezel. It's almost encapsulating. You're kind of drawn into it. The next detail to note is the tip of the second hand comparison to the 300-meter Aquaracer that we've reviewed previously on the channel. We'll link it up here if you want to see that. It actually isn't colored. It's in the same polished steel as the bottom of the second hand, which I really like. It adds a cleanness to the dial. Then you get to the hour markers. All of them are symmetrical and are the same shape, whereas in the previous model, it kind of alternated between rectangles and circles. Again, it adds that symmetry to me, and being a photographer, I'm all about that. The hour markers are actually raised, and the Tag Heuer Aquaracer logo at the top below the 12 mark are lowered. Now this gives almost a 3-layered approach to the dial, which gives it so much more extra depth. And a little thing to note, Drew and I were looking at this watch before we started filming, and we realized that the etching, the hexagonal pattern almost seems deeper, more engraved than the previous models. I don't know if this is just in my head, but it looks better. The lume on the dial is, well, it's really, really cool. Check this out, right? We're gonna get our flashlight, as we normally do. We're gonna blind me, and now we're gonna look at the lume. So as you can see here, it is a bright green lume, but when you get to the second hand and the minute hand, it's actually blue. I love this contrast, and actually it's a darker blue lume than I'm used to. So I'm actually just taking a couple of photos for our Chisholm Hunter Watches Instagram page. So that is our new Instagram page. I know a couple of you follow us in there already, but if you want us to review any watches in particular, or just want to send me or Drew a DM in particular, then make sure you follow us on that page. Right, next on the hit list is the bezel. The bezel. The bezel is an interesting one, and let me tell you why it's an interesting one. They have gravitated away from the ceramic bezel and they've used a steel bezel. My old Omega Seamaster Great White used to have a steel bezel, and it had the white dial, and I loved the way that the steel reflected the light. It almost looked like a white bezel and a white dial. This, again, contrasts with the dial really, really nicely, especially with that gradient, because the black borders are, well, they're kind of black. But then you need to think of the durability aspect. Ceramic is, by definition, more durable than steel, and it won't scratch as much. I'm not sure whether a steel bezel should be on a sports watch, but I like the fact it's on a sports watch. It makes it more dressy. I'm just not sure how I feel about it. But then you get to the fact that they've used brushed steel on the bezel instead of polished, which is great because it doesn't show scratches as much. I think that this actually plays really, really nicely with the dial. I love the way that the black numerals reflect when it almost looks like white on black when it's reflecting the light on that bezel. The bezel is a big feature to me. I just don't know if I'd pick that or the ceramic 300 that we've reviewed previously. It's just really difficult. Let's talk about the crown. The crown actually has crown guards to support it, and basically what crown guards do is protect the crown that sits in between. And I quite like them. They're not too intrusive. On other luxury watch divers we've reviewed, they can be too big. They can get to a stage where you're bending your wrist and it's digging into the side of your wrist. This doesn't do that, and it's nice and flat. I really like it. Before we move on to the specs of this model, let's review the bracelet. Let's take a look at the bracelet. So the bracelet is a combination of polished and brushed steel. It has the polished running down the center, giving it a really nice contrast and design. Then you have the deployment clasp on the end, and it also has micro adjustments. These micro adjustments mean that it can be fitted exactly to the specifications of your wrist. And finally, we move on to the specs. So the case diameter comes in at 40 millimeters in, well, diameter, but I have to say it wears slightly smaller than this. I'm not sure if it's the hexagonal steel case. I'm not really sure. It wears a bit more like a 39 to me. And we couldn't find the stats online with the thickness or the lug to lug, so out with our toolkit. Let's take a look. Firstly, at the thickness. It comes in at 11.6 millimeters in thickness, according to our thing. Let's take a closer look at the lug to lug together on our toolkit. Remember that this is rough because our tools aren't exact. It's roughly 45 millimeters. I'd maybe go to 44.5-ish, giving our tool sort of ratio. And this is an interesting watch. And it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One of them is that I think it combines dress and sports perfectly. It has that steel bezel, which you would normally see on the dress watch, but it's polished and it's hexagonal, looking more sporty. And then you have the bracelet which is brushed and also polished. Polished is more dressy, but the brushed is more sporty. It's a really good combination, and they haven't leaned too much either way. So now we get to the weight of this model, and we're just gonna put it here like that. It comes in at 81 grams in weight, which is interesting. The reason that it's interesting is I'm gonna put my Tudor Black Bay on the scales at the moment. The Tudor Black Bay comes in at 89, so they're pretty much the same. There's not that big of a difference there. There's about 8 or 9 grams, but there's a lot of different reasons for this. One of the reasons is that my Tudor that I have on at the moment is an ETA movement. It's the old version, it's not the in-house Tudor movement. And obviously the Tag has the caliber 5 movement, so this will do some weight difference. And then also the bracelet, I've taken a couple of links out the Tudor bracelet, so it's really not comparable. But if you've been in the channel for a while and you're subscribed, and if you could subscribe, I'd really, really appreciate that. It really means a lot to Drew and I here in the studio. But what I was going to say is sometimes watches, especially ones with rubber straps that you're only measuring really the face, they have very large variances. And it's just quite interesting to see what brands weigh more than others. The movement as covered just there is the caliber 5 automatic movement. It has 38 hours of power and it beats at a frequency of 28,800 VPH. By the way, if you like these watches and want to have a closer look, they are now all on the Chisholm Hunter website, which is linked below. I'm not gonna lie, when Drew and I first saw this on the website, we first saw the release coming out, we didn't know what to expect. The steel bezel really threw me off, and online, the colors looked a little bit flat. But here's the thing, when you get this in person, you can reflect it in the light. You can see the depth on the dial. And you just can't do that online. And it's not just this Tag model, it's every model in the industry. On the wrist, they look and feel so much better. And I'm not gonna lie, I wouldn't say this if I didn't mean it. I really like this model. When Drew and I sat down last summer, I think it was, and we sat down and we were spitballing ideas and we came up with time in the wrist, this is what we wanted to portray. Depending on how the light bounces, depending on the setting, depending on whether it's light or dark outside, the watch looks different. And that's what we want to show you in these videos. This watch is a perfect example of something that looks maybe a little bit less colorful and bright online, but when you get it in person, it's stunning. My name is Harrison. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Time in the Wrist at Chisholm Hunter. Subscribe.